I wondered if it mattered. Not in a dramatic way, and not because something had clearly gone wrong. The question didn't arrive with urgency. It didn't demand an answer. It surfaced quietly, almost casually, as if it had been waiting for the right moment to be noticed. I wondered if it mattered because nothing reacted. The situation continued as expected. No one paused. No one adjusted their behavior. There was no signal that suggested significance. From the outside, everything appeared intact. The moment passed without resistance. Whatever had happened blended seamlessly into what came next, which made it easy to assume that it hadn't mattered at all. If it had mattered, I thought, surely something would have shifted. But nothing did. The absence of consequence can be persuasive. It convinces you that your actions, or inactions, have landed safely within acceptable limits. So I let the question remain open, not because I didn't care, but because caring would have required examination, and examination would have slowed things down. I wondered if it mattered because addressing it felt disproportionate. The reaction required seemed larger than the event itself. Naming it would have added weight, where weight didn't appear to be necessary, so I stayed with the surface explanation. That it was minor, that it was inconsequential, that it would dissolve on its own. That explanation was convenient. It aligned with how smoothly everything else was moving. Nothing in the environment suggested otherwise. No one looked unsettled. No one asked questions. The world didn't pause to check whether something had been overlooked, which made it easier to move on. I wondered if it mattered because part of me noticed something that didn't register anywhere else. A slight misalignment, a small discrepancy between what had occurred and how it was being treated. It wasn't enough to call it a problem. It wasn't clear enough to demand correction. It existed in that quiet space, where things are felt but not yet named. And because it wasn't named, it didn't fully exist. I continued as if nothing had happened. Conversations progressed. Decisions were made. Time moved forward without interruption. And yet the question remained. Not pressing, not insistent, just present. I wondered if it mattered because I couldn't identify. What exactly would change if I treated it as significant? There was no obvious outcome to improve, no visible harm to prevent, no clear benefit to addressing it. In practical terms, everything was already resolved. So why linger? That logic was difficult to argue against. It framed attention as unnecessary effort, engagement as optional. I told myself that not everything deserves analysis, that some moments are too small to hold. That significance is something revealed over time, not something you assign prematurely. And maybe that's true. But I began to notice how often I used that reasoning, how frequently I deferred understanding, in favor of closure. If something didn't clearly matter, I treated it as if it didn't matter at all. The distinction between uncertainty and irrelevance became increasingly thin. I wondered if it mattered, because the question kept returning, long after the moment had ended, not as regret, not as doubt, but as a subtle recalibration, a sense that something had been registered internally, without being acknowledged externally. The moment hadn't demanded attention, but it had left a trace. I noticed how easily I moved past it, how quickly I accepted the absence of reaction as proof of insignificance. I realized then that the world doesn't always respond to what matters. It responds to what interrupts. And because this hadn't interrupted anything, it had gone unnoticed by everyone, including me. I wondered if it mattered, because I had learned to measure importance by visibility. If something altered outcomes, changed behavior, or required adjustment, it mattered. If it didn't, it was dismissed. But not everything that matters announces itself. Some things operate quietly. They don't alter the surface of events. They change orientation instead. The way you interpret the next moment, the way you hesitate before speaking, the way you decide what deserves attention. Those changes are difficult to track. They don't show up immediately. They don't ask to be addressed, which is why they last. I began to see how often I relied on external confirmation to validate internal signals. If no one else reacted, I assumed there was nothing to respond to. If the situation moved on, I followed. That habit felt efficient. It reduced friction. It kept things manageable. But it also trained me to ignore anything that didn't produce immediate evidence. I wondered if it mattered, because something in me resisted letting it disappear completely. Not enough to stop everything. Not enough to call it out. Just enough to notice that the question hadn't resolved itself. It hadn't faded. It had settled. I realized then that wondering if something matters is often the first sign that it does. Not because it demands action, but because it resists dismissal. The question itself becomes the indicator. If it truly didn't matter, it wouldn't return. It wouldn't linger in the background. It wouldn't resurface in quiet moments. When nothing else was asking for attention, I wondered if it mattered. Because part of me recognized that I had already made a choice. By not engaging, by not naming it, by allowing the moment to pass, without assigning meaning. That choice had felt neutral. But neutrality is rarely neutral. It shapes what you notice next, what you respond to, what you allow to remain unexamined. I don't believe that everything matters equally. I still don't, but I've learned that dismissing a moment, simply because it doesn't disrupt anything, is a form of decision-making. It prioritizes continuity over understanding, smoothness over awareness. I wondered if it mattered. And for a long time, I took the absence of consequence as my answer. Only later did I understand. That consequence isn't always immediate. Sometimes it arrives as a shift in how you relate to moments that follow. The question didn't need to be answered right away, but it did need to be acknowledged. Because wondering if something matters is often less about the moment itself and more about whether you're still paying attention. I wondered if it mattered, and the world didn't pause to respond. Everything continued as expected, which is precisely why the question stayed with me. Not as doubt, not as regret, just as awareness.